thank you, Cheryl. And Cheryl and I are both colleagues and friends, and it's been a pleasure to work with her over the years. Those of you, my contact information up here includes my Twitter name, and anybody who follows me will get extra credit, and appealing to the students in the room. And I wanted to start with a quote. I must say, as to what I have seen of Texas, it has the best prospects for health I ever saw, and I do believe it is fortunate to any man to come here. Well, excusing the reference to any man, this was in my hotel room, and anybody know whose quote this is?
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett. There you go. Extra credit again, Davy Crockett. So Davy Crockett said that Texas has the best prospects for health I've ever saw. Not the best English, but it's Davy Crockett. And I thought that I agree with him. And I want to thank Cheryl and her team for organizing my visit and making me feel special, which I don't feel at home very often, as you know. When you're back in your job, you are underappreciated, so to speak. So it's always nice to go out and visit and see colleagues. So what I want to talk about is this issue of e-cigarettes and how we're somewhat missing the boat in terms of trying to strive for common ground, as opposed to where the current situation is very divisive and unpleasant, because both primarily the public health community is very split over the issue of e-cigarettes, and it's become very personal and very argumentative, and the net effect has been very confusing for the people who should be getting clear messages. And so we're going to talk about that now, and how to begin to behave a little bit more responsibly with the intent of providing smokers information that can help them make the right decision to improve their health. And it really is pretty simple, and for some reason we've made it incredibly complicated, and those of you who have been in tobacco control long enough know that we have a tendency to do that. We have a tendency to fight amongst ourselves as opposed to strategically working against the tobacco industry. And the tobacco industry just kind of snickers because we waste all our energy infighting. So it was nice to see last week an announcement that Imperial Tobacco in the UK released a press release criticizing Philip Morris on their data that e-cigarettes don't release any particulates. Or Philip Morris's new product, the Heat Not Burn product, doesn't release any particulates in a room when it's used, and that another tobacco company went after them, both with a published article as well as a press release. And so it's good that both sides are fighting, but we can't lose sight of why we're here and what we're trying to do, because we actually are dealing with a very serious problem, and I'll mention that in more detail. So let me just provide some disclosures that, as is the case with Cheryl, we're funded by the FDA and NIH through our T-Course grant, and we also have a large grant from Pfizer to work in China with the goal of beginning to change social norms in China. A recent study came out. Well, you know, with the problem in China, there's 300 million smokers in China, and there's no interest in quitting. And a study came out that was, I think it was published in Preventing Chronic Disease, and they looked at smokers in China in terms of stages of change, and only 3% of Chinese smokers were in the action stage of quitting. So quitting is not it's not modeled. It's not a behavior that they smoke and then they die. Fundamentally in China, whereas in this country, there are more ex-smokers and current smokers, where in China there's only about less than 10% of people have quit. So we're working in China, and we can talk more about that in the question section, about trying to begin to change social norms so that quitting smoking is aspirational, and people have self-efficacy about their ability to do it, which is not the case now. And my remarks today are in no way reflective of official positions of either NIH or the Food and Drug Administration. And as all projects of this magnitude, it's a team effort, and we have a very strong team back in Atlanta that provides the support and the information and the data that I'm sharing with you today. So there's a couple, these are an outline, these are the points I want to make, and there'll only be 1 or 2 slides for each of the points, but kind of the executive summary of my remarks is that everyone knows smoking's bad. So how did we wind up in this mess that we're in today, and how do we get out of it? Kind of cutting to the chase and trying to transcend some of the hostility and arguments. And so what I want to review is just 1 or 2 slides on the current harm, the fact that our trajectory is not sufficient for us to achieve objectives we would like to see from a public health standpoint. How we got into this was based on an adolescent decision, both meaning that it was made by adolescents and it was not very well thought out in terms of being adolescent. That today's smokers have full knowledge. That's not the issue. The issue that we're not sufficiently tapping is that there's remarkable levels of regret and guilt and desire to escape this addiction, and we're not successful in that area. Then I will just switch to talk more specifically about ENDS, electronic nicotine delivery systems, and what potential or harm they may have, and then conclude by how do we provide the best information possible for informed decision making that will benefit the public health, and how risk perceptions are an important part of health communications, and that we need to understand that there is common ground on this, as opposed to just arguing and or worse. I mean, I'm waiting for a fist fight to break out if you get the wrong people in the room at the same time. So that's hopefully, and I will run through this fairly quickly, but that's to tell the story of how we got into this mess and what we need to do to get out of it. So the mess, what's the mess? The mess is there's 480,000 deaths a year primarily due to smoking, and that it's the largest cause of death from smoking is lung cancer. And I presented some of the data yesterday in the webinar that in many countries, including the US, there was a period of time in the 80s where more men, middle-aged men, died of cancer caused by smoking than died from all other types of cancers combined. And even today, if you look at the American Cancer Society's Facts and Figures publication, lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death, and if you add up the next 4 causes of cancer death, which are colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, if you add up those 4 cancers, the number of cancer deaths in the United States is equal to the number of lung cancer deaths. And so, I mean, that's sobering, that more people die of lung cancer than the next 4 cancers combined. And lung cancer is the only one of those that's really preventable. I mean, because 90% of lung cancer is caused by smoking. And so that's why I call it a mess. Leading preventable cause, lung cancer being the single greatest cause of death, and it's almost exclusively caused by cigarette smoking. And caused by cigarette smoking in the truest sense, that it's the smoke that causes the greatest harm. So we are in a situation where we have the epi, we've had it for 50 years, I heard stories at a meeting I was at on Monday from a guy, some of you may know, Ulysses Dorothea, who's head of SEACTA, the Southeast Asia Tobacco Control Association. And his work in, he was saying in Vietnam and in the Philippines, people didn't believe the harm from smoking because the data are from the US and they wanted the data from their country. And he's saying, he's a physician, he's saying, it doesn't matter, you know, whether you're Vietnamese or Filipino, there's no difference in the biology that occurs when you smoke and its effect on health. But, you know, partly inspired by the tobacco companies, they require country-specific data as opposed to what we've known for over 50 years, which is, you know, smoking causes lung cancer. So the harm, even though there may be manifestations of it in some parts of the world requiring country-specific data, in this country certainly everyone knows that smoking's bad, and so it's not a knowledge issue. And I'll talk more about what it is an issue of, but what we see next is that, you know, CDC and its success stories, I forget what it was called exactly, but, you know, the reduction in tobacco use in the second half of the 20th century was one of the 10 greatest victories, public health victories. And, you know, it has been, and you know, smoking rates are half of what it was 50 years ago, and per capita consumption, or total consumption is half of what it was 50 years ago. But we still have over 40 million smokers, and we still have 480,000 deaths. And when you look at projections about how we're going to do, this is data from Ken Warner at Michigan, where the red line represents if we continue the status quo, by 2050, we'll be a little bit under 15% smoking prevalence, and we'll still have tens of millions of smokers. And to begin to really get an increase, we have to accelerate what we are doing. And this blue line is if initiation rates are cut by 25% and cessation rates are increased by 25%. And that brings us to about 10% prevalence. And then this yellow line or green line is 50% improvements in cutting back initiation and increase in cessation. And only then do you get into single digits of smoking prevalence. But single digits of smoking prevalence in 2050 is still talking of tens of millions of smokers. And so you look at this and you say, this is really depressing. You know, we know it kills you. And so how do we really disrupt the status quo? How do we accelerate these lines so that, you know, for me, for always, it's been an issue of getting smoking rates in single digits. And that's very doable if we were to do what we know works and we were to take the positions and policies and did it more smartly. But if we go the way we go, are projected to go, we will not reach that. Again, so how did we get here? And we got here because it was an adolescent decision. And you know, I don't need to tell this group, who are really experts in adolescent decisions, health decisions, about this. But we, you know, most people start before the age of 18, and that, you know, adolescent minds don't really fully understand addiction. They don't appreciate cumulative risk. They are, you know, short-term thinkers. And, you know, I mean, Cheryl and I have testified in front of courts of law under oath on these issues. And the tobacco industry has played a role in facilitating these beliefs on top of adolescents being adolescents. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I can say that, and I mentioned this yesterday, that when I became director of the Office on Smoking and Health in 1992, there had never been a report on kids, on youth smoking, which was fairly unbelievable, given that that's when people start smoking. And so I asked Cheryl, to be the senior scientific editor of the first report on kids, which came out in 1994 and was a landmark report over time. And I don't know if I've ever shared this with Cheryl, the same week that the report was released was the week that David Kessler wrote a letter indicating his intent to regulate tobacco products. And that became front page, and the report on kids was page 17. And it was like, what bad timing. It's like, it's great that he did it, but he'd have to do it the same week in February of 1994. And what happened, ironically, over time, the report has had a lasting legacy to the point where it's been repeated, what year? 2012? And in that report, it was, determined for the first time that 83% of smokers start before the age of 18, that it was really an adolescent behavior. We wouldn't be where we were if it wasn't for people starting as teens and regretting it by the time they graduate from high school. So the adolescent dimension of smoking is so important, and the work that you're doing here is so important to really understand that. And unfortunately, as you'll see, it's being played out again around e-cigarettes. I'm going to skip this slide just because you know this, but I do want to say that it's, in my opinion, it's not inherent in adolescents' life that they must smoke, but it was very concerted to appeal to young people to get them to smoke. And here's just some industry quotes that were said at a time before they knew to be more politically correct, where they didn't say these things because they knew they would come up in litigation. And in fact, you were the DOJ witness also? Okay. So I was a witness in the DOJ case, and one of the documents I saw in the DOJ case, and all became an issue of, did they target kids or not? Where's the evidence they targeted kids? And forever, they would say, we're not targeting kids, we're targeting young adult smokers. And so that became YAS. Young adult smokers became the terminology that every industry document included, that we need to market to appeal to young adult smokers. And I found a memo that was a Brown and Williamson memo that basically said, in the future, whenever speaking about the lower end of our target population, please use the term young adult smokers. And so they didn't say teens, but they knew they were getting a directive. This is the term you use, young adult smokers, when you're talking about kids. And all it is to say is that it's clear that the focus, the problem with adolescent smoking is a combination of adolescent risk-taking and industry solicitation. And the context of that is simply what implications are there going to be for e-cigarettes in that regard. And, it's not good so far. So let's move from kids and to talk specifically about smokers. This is, I think, really an important point, and one that we haven't sufficiently explored, although the tobacco companies once again have. And again, I'll give an example. So it's not a knowledge issue. It's not a knowledge issue. They know, but what the salient emotions are regret and guilt and looking for a way out. This is data from Gallup that looked at, asked smokers, all things considered, would you like to give up smoking or not? And this is, the green line is yes, and the yellow line is no. And, it goes back to 1977. And, there aren't that many surveys that I can see, or that I'm aware of, that has such a stable line of consistent regret. of wanting not to smoke. And it's a little higher now than it was 40 years ago, but it vacillates a little bit, but in a very tight range. That smokers, the majority of smokers, 70% of smokers, depending upon the survey, they'd like to quit, they regret starting, they think it's the stupidest decision they have ever made, and they made it as an adolescent, and they've tried to quit and failed. And so in my work, I've worked, in fact, I won't get into this, it would be a big distraction, but I work for I consulted for a large company in Houston on smoking policy and smoking cessation programs, and one of their vice presidents was in a group preparing for the company to go smoke-free, and he smoked himself, and he broke down in tears. And it was like, what's wrong? And he says, my kids don't respect me because they want me to quit and I can't. And I've lost their respect and it humiliates me and I'm embarrassed. And he started crying. And that's some of the real tragedy that we don't measure of people who smoke, who are successful in their life, but that they're losing the respect of their family and others because of this addiction that they can't break. And so there's this sense of regret. There's also this sense of guilt. And this is one of the sadder things, that when I was, again, testifying in one of these trials, seeing the documents with light cigarettes, the whole light cigarette experience, and many of you I know are involved with and have published on, light cigarettes were marketed in a way, and this is the industry's words, to assuage the guilt of smokers, particularly women smokers, who had the role in the 70s particularly of being the health manager of the family. And they themselves were engaging in a behavior that put them at risk, and they felt guilty over it. And lights were marketed to assuage the guilt. And it was like, wow, oh, what a beautiful term, assuage the guilt. And they developed the advertising campaigns to assuage the guilt. If you have to smoke true. It's just unbelievable. And so part of the problem now that we have with e-cigarettes is that people are concerned that this is going to happen again, that e-cigarettes are going to be positioned in a way to assuage the guilt, when in fact, whether they do or don't, and whether people use both at the same time are part of the reality that we're seeing. So there's incredible regret. These are just, I'll just read off a couple of these. These are some qualitative statements. One of our colleagues on our project is Paul Slovic from Oregon, and Paul is widely considered to be the father of risk perception research, and has published over 400 articles and a number of books, and is a psychologist who has a theoretical perspective on people's perceptions of risk and how that influences their behavior, and we're trying to incorporate that in our grant. This is just some qualitative comments that have come up when you talk to smokers, where they say it's gross, it kills, I'm addicted, I would rather quit. And so, tapping into the affect and his whole, and this is those of you, postdocs and graduate students who are interested in behavior change, Paul's whole premise is that behavior change occurs by affecting, he uses better words than I do, affecting affect as opposed to affecting cognitions. And their paradigm is called the affect heuristic, and they base it on evolutionary biology data and other data of how people actually behave differentially when you can appeal in a compelling way to affect. And that again is something we do a little bit with fear arousal and health warning label or graphic packages, but I don't think we are sufficiently tapping into the theoretical underpinnings of why people behave the way they do, we tend to focus more on cognitions than on affect. And so let me share now with you some data from our work that is beginning to try to tap into the issue of regret and misery, which is the other dimension that people tend not to, defense mechanisms and denial are very powerful, and people don't tend to personalize the risk that it could happen to them or fully understand the misery associated with these conditions. So has anyone in here lived with or known someone who has had either lung cancer or emphysema? And so what's their death been like? Has it been horrid, grueling? My mother-in-law died of emphysema, and she worried about every breath, whether she could get another one. And you talk about quality of life. If you're worried about your next breath, we don't even pay attention to her breath, she didn't know she'd have another breath. And so her ability to play with her grandchildren, travel, were all off the table. And that type of misery is underappreciated, and if people could get a better idea of the true misery associated with tobacco conditions, it may change their behavior because of the affect associated with that. So, what are we learning from our T-Course data? And we're very excited. This data that I'll be showing you now comes from this summer, 15. We got the data, and just a little story. Scott Weaver, one of our investigators, submitted an abstract for a poster at a T-Course meeting back in March or something, whenever it was due, and he said the title of the abstract was comparing 2014 and 2015 data on e-cigarettes, and it got accepted. And when it was accepted, I don't even think the survey was in the field yet. The 2015 survey was in the field yet. And I said, Scott, you wrote an abstract saying you're going to show 2015 data, and people are going to be excited about that, but you have no data. It's not even collected yet. And I really put a guilt trip on him. I said, Scott, you're going to have to retract the abstract. You can't do this. And he said, oh, we might get it. We might be able to do it. And I said, Scott, people are going to really want to see this data. And so we did. He did. We got the data. We closed it out. He worked day and night getting it ready for presentation. And so, the data is like a month post collection. And we're excited about it. And this one is an example, again, about regret. I would not have started smoking cigarettes, strongly disagree, etc. And you can see that about 70% either somewhat agree or strongly agree that they have high levels of regret. And then we looked at this by gender in the beginning, male and female, and then over age. And, there is no variation. I mean, it's like consistent. People regret, men, women, young, old. It's just something that they really wish they hadn't done. And part of our challenge is obviously, how do you capitalize on this? How do you help people overcome this regret? And I have smoked. I know, both the difficulty, but even more the satisfaction of quitting, and how important that is in terms of self-concept. And so, again, I know this, you won't be able to read this, but it'll be archived with the presentation. But this is kind of the conceptual framework from Paul Slovic that emphasizes that we tend to look at superficial awareness that smoking's bad, and then progress down to how is it bad, what does it do, but this deeper knowledge is what we need to tap into, that personalizes it and acknowledges the regret of participating in the behavior. And this is more in keeping with what we need to communicate as we develop messages. So how do ends fit into all of this? And what is, where are we heading? And, many feel, and perhaps legitimately, that ends could be disruptive, that they could provide something that we haven't been able to do since the last half century, that these products are almost certainly less harmful than combusted cigarettes, and they are considered by some to be an option for cessation. Now, this is where it starts to get complicated. In September, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force updated their conclusions on tobacco cessation interventions and concluded that e-cigarettes did not have sufficient evidence to recommend them for cessation. And so, the Clinical Guide to Preventive Services is the entity that makes these determinations, and then their recommendations drive reimbursement through Medicaid and Medicare and level. And so the extant conclusion of the task force is that there is insufficient evidence. And so that's a very important finding. Here are the position statements of the major voluntary and health organizations in the United States. And this was a real learning experience for me of going back to try to reconstruct this. And so the Lung Association, their official resolution or policy statement basically says the Lung Association does not support using them for cessation, nor does it support any direct or implied claims that e-cigarettes help smokers quit. So the Lung Association is pretty negative on it. The Heart Association, there's not enough evidence for clinicians to counsel their patients who are using combustible products that using e-cigarettes as a primary cessation aid. The efficacy of e-cigarettes as a primary smoking cessation aid has not been established as being better than other cessation modalities. The AMA, it's a little harder to get their position statements because their position statements tend to be focused more on the issue that FDA should regulate as opposed to what clinicians should do. But in one of their statements, they say they support regulations that prohibit claims that electronic cigarettes are effective. And then just on Monday of this week, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with their position statement saying there's a critical need for regulation, legislative action, and counter-promotion to protect youth. ENDS have the potential to addict the next generation of youth to nicotine and reverse 50 years of progress. So you have in front of you the Clinical Guide to Preventive Services Task Force saying the evidence is insufficient, and the major health organizations in the United States of America all very negative about this, which is really interesting when you actually see what's going on. And then you go to England, the country across the sea, and with Public Health England, their public health agency prepared a report that was released a month ago that says the current best estimates is that e-cigarette use is around 95% less harmful to health than smoking. And you can see what happened within days of this statement coming out. This is a window of a vape shop in London, and they took that statement and says NHS, or the National Health Service, says 95% safer than smoking. And this 95% estimate has been widely criticized, including by myself, because it's not empirical data. It's expert opinion of people who came up with this estimate. And that fact, the focus on the 95% safer has obscured the larger issue that in the UK, they're recommending that e-cigarettes be incorporated into cessation practice and that it be available just like Nicorette or nicotine replacement therapy, which is obviously a far cry from where we are in the United States. So I've given this a lot of thought, and I figure this is called the saltwater effect or the Atlantic Ocean effect. I mean, how can two countries that are, both research intensive come up with such fundamental different positions on the same issue? I don't know what the answer is. It has to be the Atlantic salt water, is all I can think. And again, let me show you some data. So, just start to imagine this. You have 42 million Americans who are smokers. 70% regret it, want to quit, wish they never started, looking for a way out, try and fail. And at the same time, and so they're saying, what should I do about e-cigarettes? Should I try them? And so, well, you want to say, well, it depends where you live. If you live in the U.S., you should try them, but if you live in the U.K., you shouldn't. And so there's this incredible confusion and uncertainty. And then they said, well, what does the FDA say? Well, nothing. The FDA sent the deeming rule to OMB last Monday, and OMB has 60 days to act on it. But in the deeming rule, as currently written, as proposed, a company has 2 years to comply with the regulations that FDA may stipulate. So, for instance, if FDA says flavors should be banned in e-cigarettes and say that in, January of 16, the companies would not have to ban it until January of 18 by statute. And that doesn't even talk about litigation. So uncertainty, it's not just, it's uncertainty and confusion and regret, all this stuff. And then, so people are confused. And we need to work on that. Here's some of the data that we have on this. And so this is kind of the theme of what we're doing. And we were fortunate to have done a survey in 2012 before our T-course was funded with the same questions. And we asked them, the green line is 2012 and the blue line is 2014, is are e-cigarettes more harmful or less harmful than traditional smoking? And the modal response is, I don't know. And in 2012, 56% of the people said, I don't know. And even in 2014, the largest response category was, I don't know. And that's probably the right answer. I don't know. That's what the scientists are telling them. Again, the U.S. is saying, I don't know, and the U.K. is saying, yes, use it. But I think if people exclusively used e-cigarettes, it would be better than smoking. And I won't show you this data here, but what we know is that, of current adult smokers in the U.S., 70 to 90% use e-cigarettes and continue to smoke. So the vast majority of e-cigarette users are dual users. And at SRNT meeting, the CDC reported that the average reduction in the number of cigarettes smoked was went from 14 to 11 cigarettes. So there was a 3-cigarette reduction in smoking among dual users, which is pretty pathetic. And so you're getting a lot of nicotine, which could be making it more difficult to quit entirely, and we just don't know. We don't know anything really about dual use. And so this some qualitative data that we generated word clouds from our survey respondents of what they think when they hear the word cigarette. And this is smokers and non-smokers alike. And you can see that there's quite negative words, thinking death, lungs, cancer, disgusting, gross, nasty, bad. The size of the word is a reflection of the frequency in which it's been said. And we asked the same thing about e-cigarettes, and this is what you got. A whole different mental view. Cigarettes, vapor, stupid, fake, not health concerns as much as other types of concerns. So these are some of the areas that we're exploring. The other thing that hopefully I've conveyed is that there is difference of opinion, not only among the public and confusion and not knowing, but in the public health community, using the UK and the US as examples. And even beyond that, in terms of how these products are being used. So there was an article in the BMJ from an academic in the UK who basically concluded that when a patient's in the hospital, they should be given free as e-cigarettes. I assume they're talking about smoking patients, not all patients, but it's not clear. And so there's these big differences of opinion, and then it gets, on the other side, it gets that some countries, the countries in red, have banned e-cigarettes. So in the US, it's a $3.5 billion industry. In the UK, it's being advocated as a cessation therapy within the national health system, and the countries in red have banned it. So this is Davy Crockett. I mean, this is like Wild Wild West. This is like, inconsistent, hard to figure out, and what the net effect is, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of confusion. I've talked too long, and so I'm going to wrap up, but I do want to show you a couple of things. So I'm going to skip through a couple of slides, so close your eyes. This is a little bit about our T-cores, and I don't need to talk about that, but I do want to summarize what we're doing at Georgia State. Again, we're working with Paul Slovic, who's a collaborator, a co-investigator, that we want to focus on this deeper understanding of risk and to develop communications that tap into that, and also assess how they view the world, which is an important factor in terms of technology and their diffusion of innovations and things. So we're trying to look at this very much in a non-cognitive way, but in an emotional and affect way that builds upon social psychological theory. Let me conclude just by showing you a couple of more data slides of the type of information we're collecting. And again, this is from the recently completed summer survey of this year. And this is beginning to try to tap into the issues of regret and misery. How often do you worry about getting lung cancer? A third of smokers don't worry about lung cancer, but 2/3 of smokers worry about it at some level. Now, that's really depressing to me, that people, that worry about getting lung cancer. Lung cancer is such a horrible disease, and, if you're worrying about it, it's often or all the time, that's really what that does to your quality of life, is having that type of fear. So we're trying to tap into worry. I'll skip this one, and I'll skip that one. I have time. This is the one I'll leave you with, and this is the one that our Scott Weaver was up till all hours of the night before we got this done before I made a presentation last week. And this was an issue about who do you trust for information on the health effects of e-cigarettes. And the blue line is 6,000 adults in the U.S., and the red line are vapors, people who are currently using e-cigarettes. And what you see is phenomenal, I think, is that, so it was a scale with 0 being neither trust or distrust, and 1 being trust a lot and 2 being trust extremely type of thing, and same on the negative side. So we plotted it all in relationship to whether they trust someone or not. The only groups that are trusted are health experts and scientists, the FDA, and CDC.
And not very much.
Well, I was surprised that it was positive at all, because if you read the social media, the vaping community hate the FDA, hate CDC, and I've seen even last week, presentations about how the CDC is lying to the public, they're killing people, they're not telling the truth about e-cigarettes. So it's not very high, but it's something that we need to know to work with about how we communicate. Who are people trusting? Now, who they're not trusting, the tobacco companies, the vaping companies, the media, and vape shops. So all the people who they interact with, they don't trust, and they trust government authorities. And this is not social media voices. This is nationally representative survey of adults and of vapors. And so this is the type of information that we'd love to see this repeated with adolescents, and say, who do you trust? And it may be totally different, and because of this social media, how people get information, the internet, et cetera. So as we go forward, this is the information we're collected, and this is my last slide, is that what we're missing here is that, honestly, every day this week there's been a story on e-cigarettes on the news and on the front page. So the increase in the visibility of electronic cigarettes needs to be capitalized on, not in terms of who's right or who's wrong, but in terms of exploiting the fact that more smokers are thinking about quitting. And how do we capitalize on that to get more smokers to try to quit, regardless of how they do it, and to emphasize cessation, which we've never done very well in my mind. So this is an unprecedented interest in quitting, and that we're obligated to communicate the best available information to improve decision making. That's the theme of our T-course. We don't know exactly how we're going to do it yet, but I believe that if we can provide straightforward, consistent information based on the evidence, with the overlying purpose is to help people quit, we'll be successful, and we'll be endeavoring for the next 3 years to do that. We need to remember in doing this is that there are proven effective methods that ironically have been approved by the FDA, but also realizing that they have very low effectiveness rates and that many people have tried and they haven't worked. And ends may be appropriate for it to be recommended by a physician off-label is how it would have to be, since there's no approval of it from a regulatory standpoint, if it's used for a limited period of time and with the goal of cessation. But also, there's little evidence about either the effectiveness of it as a smoking cessation. Remember, Preventive Services Task Force said the evidence was insufficient, or what the unintended consequences are. And that's another lecture, but that's the FDA has to make their rulemaking based on the effect of these products on population health. That smokers need to get information that dual use is bad, probably, although some argue that dual use has a therapeutic benefit that allows for a transition, but there is no data on that. We don't know that. And that I've said all these things on Twitter and have gotten a sale, but that also that it should be used for a period of time. It should be limited in terms of people's use of these products for the purposes of cessation, when most people on Twitter say, well, I won't tell you what they say to me, but they basically say, who are you to tell me what to do, and if I want to use them for the rest of my life, that's my decision, not yours, etc. That we need as a public health community, we need to help people understand that there's a possibility of having individual benefit, that smokers quit, but also could have population harm. And so how can you have benefit and harm? Well, if a lot of kids start smoking, that's harmful, and if a lot of people have dual use, or people return to smoking, that's harmful. And so you have to look at the net. Is there more harm than benefit, or benefit than harm? And that's the FDA's challenge. And then lastly, to use the public discourse on this topic to really push tobacco control policies and have as a common goal of quitting the use of combusted products. We can agree on that, I think, although I've said that and people have never agreed. But use this as an opportunity. I mean, when I've said this amongst my colleagues in public health, they say e-cigarettes are a distraction. I don't see them as a distraction. I see them as a vehicle to focus on cessation and to help people achieve what they want, which is to quit and get over the regret and the guilt that they've had. So this is our team, both our staff and as well as our advisory group, and we can say that we have both Ken Warner and Stan Glantz. I don't know, where is Stan? Is he on there? There. Oh yeah, they're close to each other. Both Ken and Stan on our advisory committee, and so I'm a referee at the meetings. It's always, I have to sedate myself before chairing the meeting. But we have Frank Chaluka and Jeff Copeland and a number of people, Jeff Fong, and helping guide us as we go forward. So we're very excited about the work. It's been, for me personally, really rewarding. I think the invitation to come here, and I told my wife yesterday I felt like I was treated like a rock star here, which is not how I'm treated at home. So thank you.